The Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the most enduring and complex conflicts in modern history, rooted in deep historical, religious, political, and territorial tensions. Understanding the conflict requires examining its origins, key events, and the dynamics that have shaped it over more than a century. The roots of the conflict can be traced to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During this period, the region of Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire and was inhabited by a largely Arab population, both Muslim and Christian. However, a movement known as Zionism began to gain traction among some Jewish communities, primarily in Europe. Zionism, founded by Theodor Herzl in the 1890s, was a nationalist movement that sought to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, driven by growing anti-Semitism in Europe and the historical connection of the Jewish people to the biblical land of Israel. At the time, the idea of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine was met with varying degrees of support and opposition. While some Jews migrated to the region in the early 20th century, the local Arab population, which formed the majority, largely viewed Zionism as a threat to their land and way of life. This created the foundation for future tensions. During World War I, the political landscape of the Middle East shifted dramatically. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the region of Palestine came under British control through the League of Nations mandate system. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, which expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, provided that it would not undermine the rights of the existing Arab inhabitants. This vague and contradictory promise fueled tensions between the Jewish and Arab populations. In the years that followed, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased significantly, particularly due to rising persecution in Europe, including the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, and later the horrors of the Holocaust during World War II. As Jewish settlements grew, so did Arab opposition. Clashes between Jews and Arabs became increasingly frequent, and by the 1930s, the situation had escalated into widespread violence, including the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. The British struggled to maintain order, and by the end of World War II, found themselves unable to resolve the growing conflict. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a plan to partition Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem being designated as an international city due to its religious significance to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The Jewish leadership, represented by figures like David Ben-Gurion, accepted the plan, though reluctantly, as it provided a legal framework for establishing a Jewish state. However, the Arab leadership, both in Palestine and across the region, rejected the plan, arguing that it unfairly allocated more land to the Jews, who were still a minority in the region. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel declared its independence, marking the formal establishment of a Jewish state in accordance with the UN plan. This event, however, triggered immediate hostilities. The very next day, armies from neighboring Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, launched an invasion of the newly declared state in what became known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Despite being outnumbered, the Israeli forces, many of whom were veterans of World War II, successfully defended their territory and even expanded beyond the borders allocated by the UN Partition Plan. The war resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, an event that Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Many fled or were expelled from their homes and became refugees in neighboring Arab countries, where they and their descendants remain to this day. The war also led to the division of Jerusalem, with the western part controlled by Israel and the eastern part, including the Old City, controlled by Jordan. For the next 2 decades, the conflict simmered without a formal peace agreement. Israel consolidated its statehood, while Palestinian refugees and their descendants remained in refugee camps, often in harsh conditions. The Palestinian national movement, initially weakened by the defeat, began to regroup with the formation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, in 1964. The PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, sought to establish an independent Palestinian state and viewed the destruction of Israel as necessary to achieve this goal. In the 1970s and 1980s, the conflict continued with sporadic violence and failed diplomatic efforts. However, a major turning point came in 1987 with the outbreak of the First Intifada, a Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The Intifada was marked by widespread protests, strikes, and violence, including clashes between Palestinian civilians and Israeli forces. The uprising drew international attention to the plight of Palestinians living under occupation and ultimately led to a renewed push for peace negotiations. In the early 1990s, under the sponsorship of the United States, secret negotiations between Israeli and Palestinian representatives culminated in the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. The accords, signed by Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, established a framework for the eventual creation of a Palestinian state. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel, in turn, recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The Oslo Accords led to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which was granted limited self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. However, the optimism surrounding the Oslo Accords soon faded. The agreements left many critical issues unresolved, including the status of Jerusalem, the borders of a future Palestinian state, the fate of Palestinian refugees, and Israeli settlements in the West Bank. As negotiations stalled, frustration grew on both sides. In 2000, a second Palestinian uprising, known as the Second Intifada, erupted. This period was marked by intense violence, including suicide bombings carried out by Palestinian militants and harsh Israeli military responses, resulting in significant casualties on both sides. The Second Intifada eventually subsided, but the conflict remained unresolved. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew its settlers and military from the Gaza Strip, although it maintained control over Gaza's borders, airspace, and coastline. In 2006, the Islamist group Hamas won Palestinian legislative elections and later seized control of Gaza in a violent conflict with the Palestinian Authority. This created a political divide within the Palestinian territories, with Hamas governing Gaza and the Palestinian Authority controlling parts of the West Bank. Since then, the Israel-Palestine conflict has continued in a cycle of negotiations, failed peace efforts, and recurring violence. Hamas and Israel have fought several wars, particularly in Gaza, while Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank has continued, complicating the possibility of a two-state solution. Jerusalem remains a particularly contentious issue, with both Israelis and Palestinians claiming it as their capital. International efforts to mediate peace, led by entities such as the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations, have thus far been unable to achieve a lasting resolution. The core issues, including the borders of Israel and a potential Palestinian state, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and the future of Israeli settlements, remain unresolved. In recent years, some Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, have normalized relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords brokered by the United States in 2020. While these agreements represent a shift in the broader Arab-Israeli dynamic, they have not directly addressed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Palestinians have largely viewed them as a betrayal by their Arab allies. The conflict remains deeply rooted in historical grievances, religious significance, national identity, and competing territorial claims. It is a struggle over land and sovereignty, but also over justice, security, and recognition. While many efforts have been made to resolve the conflict, a comprehensive and lasting peace has remained elusive. The Israel-Palestine conflict continues to be one of the most intractable disputes in modern history, with profound implications for both the region and the world.